I was talking to one of the survivors at the kibbutz when I was in Israel not long ago, and I asked about PTSD, and she said, having lost family members, she said, I agree with what you're saying except for the P part.
Yes.
There's nothing post about this. This is right now traumatic syndrome. There's nothing post about this. It's ongoing. It's right now. And your extrapolation of the math is so right. I don't know how anybody would expect them to do differently. And when I've watched the media report on the deaths in Palestine, and they take the Hamas numbers as gospel. But like, are you kidding me? They just report them like, okay, we've got these numbers. They got them from Hamas.
Yes.
And we know those numbers aren't correct. If you look at the population concentration in the areas they're reporting from, the demographics there, that's not who's there.
No.
There aren't that many women and children in that area. These are combatants. These aren't civilians. There aren't women and children in that part of the world that they're part of Gaza that they're reporting of. And we have pretty good demographics on who's there. It's not that big of an area.
That's right. There's a set of lies that much of the world's media has very gleefully reported. As you say, they repeat if the American government hands out statistics to the American media, the American media question the statistics quite rightly. They analyze them, they pick flaws in them. Yet when Hamas, a designated terrorist group here in the US, quite rightly, carries out a massacre and then talks about the casualty numbers on their own side, much of the American media just reports these figures as gospel truth. It's an extraordinary thing. And one of the other extraordinary things, it goes back to what you just said about the not being in the post period yet, still being in the trauma. The trauma for Israeli society is not just that this atrocity happened, but also that it was able to happen. That is, that there were breakdowns. I look at them in the book, obvious breakdowns in the security and intelligence apparatus of Israel that meant that the seventh was even possible, or to be, as it were, in the death cult's minds, as successful as it was. If you just consider that on top of that, on top of the suffering, on top of the fear that things are broken down in the state's security apparatus, you then have that added trauma of the world not even having sympathy for you. And one example I give in the book, but really I felt personally, was I got to know many of the people and spoke with many of the people who'd been at the Nova dance party when the Hamas terrorists came in and started raping and butchering and killing and chasing young Israelis across fields and mowing them down with machine guns. I spoke to a man whose daughter was killed at that festival. And there were some Americans who brought a reconstruction of and a memorial, effectively, to the Nova party to various American cities. It came to LA, it came to New York. Everywhere it went, it met protesters. And in New York, when that memorial to the victims of the Nova party happened, there was a huge crowd that gathered in the streets outside of Americans in New York, or people who live in America, chanting for intifada, that is, for armed struggle, and chanting support for Hamas. And a man whose own daughter was murdered at the festival found himself walking through the streets of New York, being screamed at by people in America who were supporting the terrorist group that slaughtered his daughter. And this, to me, is one of the things that epitomizes this. In no other situation in the world would we expect that to happen. We would be so horrified in America if survivors of 9/11 or the loved ones of people killed in 9/11 went somewhere else in the world and were attacked for being the relatives of people who'd been murdered. But that's what's happened in the last 18 months. And it reveals a sort of rot and a deep challenge that is actually coming in our own society. The question I keep coming back to is, why are there so many people among us who support the death cult?
That's the big question to me, because it seems to indicate a complete absence of critical thinking on the part of our young people. I spoke about this early on and strongly called for the resignation of the presidents of Harvard and MIT and UPenn, because they were not only allowing but encouraging this. I think when behavior occurs in patterns, those in control either elicit, maintain, or allow that to occur. And in this, it seemed to me that they were both eliciting and allowing and maintaining. These students that, to me, I suspect some of them that I spoke to on like the UCLA campus in the encampment there, I don't think they could have found Israel or Gaza on a map if you gave them 2 weeks and a flashlight. I don't think they could have found it on a map. But they're celebrating these murderers. This wasn't war. These were war crimes. And they're celebrating these terrorists that, and they're not even really terrorists. They're worse than that. They're just murderers. And they've murdered Americans, and they have taken American hostages, and they're out there celebrating them. And they're saying, well, look how many more Palestinians they've killed than Israelis were killed. Well, there were a lot more Nazis killed than there were English in the UK. Does that make Hitler correct? I mean, what kind of logic is that? What has happened to critical thinking? And we've seen the same thing at Oxford. You've seen the same thing in the UK. What has happened to critical thinking that people cannot reason their way through this?
I think several things. The first is actually something I wrote about in my last book, in my previous book, in The War on the West, which is the extent to which young Americans and young people in the West in general have been indoctrinated into a very specific theory. The theory is that the whole world can, first of all, be split up into oppressor and oppressed, victimizer, victimized, colonialist, colonized, and much more. And the other thing that young Americans have been taught for many years is that they are guilty, that we in America are guilty by dint of being in America, and specifically of being Americans. But every Western country has had some version of this. And what it always comes down to, as I said in The War on the West, is the claim that we in the West are uniquely guilty of a set of crimes: slavery, colonialism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide, racism. You know, the whole scorecard. As I said in The War on the West, first of all, most of it is complete rubbish and has been very, very badly misrepresented. For instance, it's true that America has a history of slavery, but every society in the world has a history of slavery. And uniquely in America and the West are we told that generations born centuries after the abolition of slavery should be brought up to believe they are guilty of it. And I said in The War on the West, what do you do to a society of young people when you tell them they're guilty of things that there is no answer to, because there's nobody alive did it and there's nobody alive who's the victim? And I wondered about that for a long time. I could see this system that was being set up that tells young Americans, particularly young American men, it has to be said, that they are uniquely guilty of historic crimes. I wondered what this would lead to, because, as I say, there is no mechanism for forgiveness or anything else. And one of the things that I've come to the conclusion on, and I say this on Democracies and Death Cults, is what we are seeing is what I think that any psychologist would describe as projection on a vast scale. These students and others in America are accusing Israel of crimes that they themselves have been told they're guilty of. They claim that Israel is a colonialist power when it's anything but. They claim that Israel is committing genocide when it's doing anything but. I mean, the population of Gaza has almost doubled since Israel withdrew from Gaza completely in 2005. They accuse Israel, one of the most diverse countries in the world of being racist and white supremacist. This is projection on an unbelievably grand scale, but it's also, I would submit, incredibly dangerous, because at the root of it all is this presumption not just that Israel is uniquely wicked, but that the West is uniquely wicked.
Homeowners, when's the last time you checked on your home title? If your answer is never, then this is for you. Scammers are stealing titles and your equity is the target. Criminals forge your signature, and just like that, your home title can be transferred out of your name. That's why I partnered with Home Title Lock, so you can find out today if you're already a victim. Use my promo code Phil at HometitleLock.com and you'll get a free title history report. Plus, you'll get a free trial of their $1 million triple lock protection. That's 24/7 monitoring of your title, urgent alerts to any changes, and if fraud does happen, they'll spend up to $1 million to fix it. That's HometitleLock.com, promo code Phil. It really is the West, not just Israel. And I think people in America have a hard time wrapping their heads around that. You mentioned earlier with the exhibit, and that was such a profound example. You say on page 120 in the book, one of the people inside the exhibit, Manny Manzuri, stumbled into the protest. His daughters, Roya, 22, and Norel, 25, were among those murdered at the Nova party, along with Norel's friend, Amit Cohen. And they were born in Los Angeles, attended school in Hollywood before moving to Israel. And then you talk about when he comes out, they're chanting Intifada, Intifada, fuck the Nova Music Festival. This was over their sound system, and saying it's just Zionist propaganda. And they were talking about, they were having this rave next to a concentration camp. That's exactly what this music festival was. And that even anti-Israeli activists like AOC condemned the behavior, saying the callousness and dehumanization of targeting Jews on display at last night's protest was atrocious, anti-Semitic, just plain and simple. And they refer to this as a concentration camp, and they're dancing outside it as though to taunt them. Now, concentration camp is an interesting word to use, and you make the great observation that that's a real taunt to Israelis, obviously. And how do you double a population in a concentration camp that's being targeted for genocide? I've never seen anything that's the focus of a genocidal philosophy where they double the population. Where is the reasoning of the legacy media that they push that rhetoric, they push that narrative?
Yes, I mean, here you see the fruits of the rotten tree. The rotten tree bears its fruits because the rotten tree has for years been making libelous, untrue, factually, demonstrably incorrect claims about Israel, just as it has been making such claims about America. Just as Americans have in recent years been told that actually America started in 1619, and again, this is not fringe, this is pushed by the New York Times, so these same people claim, without ever having been there or having been to the region, that Gaza is a concentration camp. Gaza is now pretty leveled because of the war that Hamas started. But Gaza in 2005 was handed back over to the Palestinians, or handed to the Palestinians, because, of course, beforehand Egypt owned it, but Egypt doesn't want it. It was handed to the Palestinians, and there were elections, and Hamas were elected, and for 18 years, Hamas got to run the Gaza. As you say, the population almost doubled in that time. Living conditions in Gaza were pretty good. They were much better than many neighboring Arab countries. And there was an opportunity that Hamas had, and the Palestinians in Gaza had, to create a thriving society that lived next door to its neighbor and which sought peace with its neighbor. But of course, Hamas wanted none of those things. And knowingly, the citizens of Gaza voted Hamas in. And from the moment that Israel withdrew from Gaza, the jihadist groups in Gaza, not just Hamas, but also Islamic Jihad and others, fired rockets into Israel. They constantly tried to break into Israel, invade Israel. And this claim that somehow, and again, it goes back to this anti-Americanism, anti-Westernism, this claim that somehow the Palestinians in Gaza don't have any self-determination or don't have any say in their own lives is demonstrably untrue. They literally had a say the moment that the Israelis left, and they voted in this death cult. And the subsequent years were extremely difficult for Israel because it didn't know effectively what to do with this neighbor beside it that was led by a group that wanted to annihilate every Jew on the planet. And once the war started after October the 7th, all these people, yes, they said Gaza was a concentration camp, as if any concentration camp in history has had, not just the population doubling, but a particularly youthful population as Gaza has had. And you'll notice that many people simultaneously have said in the last 18 months that Gaza is a concentration camp, but most of the people who are in it are young. I mean, it seems to me you have to choose one or other on that, but you can't have both. And they have spread these lies, and then it ends up with people saying, who I'm sure many of them would pride themselves on their empathy. It ends up with people saying, well, those young people dancing at the Nova party at 6:30 in the morning when the terrorists started to come in and slaughter their way through unarmed young people just at a dance party, that those young people, the victims, are uniquely undeserving of sympathy. Because if you set up one lie after another, that's where you end up. If American kids have been dancing at a dance party in the early hours of the morning and were massacred, I would expect the world to have sympathy and empathy for them. And if the world said they were the culprits in some way, I would think the world had gone sick. Well, it's the same here.
You make the point in the book, and this is where I said I learned so much from the deep, deep dive that you made on this, that you say Americans and Europeans continued to throw money at this even after up to a dozen UNRWA employees were found to have actually taken part in the October 7th massacres. And support
Yes.
from the British government and others continued. It seemed that these governments didn't care where the money went in Gaza, just so long as they kept sending it. And by the start of the 2023 war, the international community had made every Hamas leader into a billionaire, a combined worth of $11 billion, and living in these luxury hotels and all. And people that say concentration camp, I don't remember people sending billions of dollars to Auschwitz, but I do see it happening here. And there was such a contradiction that you drew, that there were descriptions given by Hamas leaders that, hey, Gaza's got a great standard of living, hotels, swimming pools, shopping, malls, everything is great. And then the other side of their mouth, hey, we're dying in here. You're controlling our utilities, you're controlling supplies that come in. And people criticize and say, that's why Israel is an apartheid state. These people don't get to vote. You're controlling all the supplies that go in. There's no seaport. They can't leave on the Israeli border side. They can't leave, or things come in on the seaport side. They're controlling everything. But they're finding explosive even in children's toys. I mean, and Israel said for years, if you let things in there without inspection, you're going to be building up their armament and they're going to use that to attack us. And then when that does happen, nobody comes back and says, yeah, sorry, you were right about that.
No, I mean, Again, you go to this amazing thing of the lack of empathy. I remember the late, great Joan Rivers in one of the previous rounds of the Gaza-Israel conflict, much smaller than this one, started again because Hamas couldn't resist flying rockets at Israel and trying to kill Israeli civilians. I remember Joan Rivers said, look, if they started it, and she memorably said, if New Jersey fired rockets at us in Manhattan, we would level New Jersey. We'd tell them to cut it out. Why is it that the world is so lacking in sympathy with Israel when this death cult spends all of its time trying to wipe Israel out? As you say, the claim, for instance, that there are checkpoints of food and other things going in and out of Gaza would not be the case if Hamas and the citizenry of Gaza could have just given up the habit of importing rocket-propelled grenades and rockets and Katyusha rockets and long and short-range rockets, or importing the components to make those rockets. There would have been no need for any checks if Hamas running Gaza could have just imported things other than weaponry to fire at and annihilate its neighbor. And the fact that so much of the world doesn't even try to understand why Israel might be concerned about rockets being imported into Gaza is just another layer of this lack of empathy that parts of the world seem to have for Israel, the lack of desire to even understand Israel's strategic and moral position. And I'd add one other to that, because a lot of our taxpayer dollars were also put underground in Gaza. They were used to build one of the world's most extensive tunnel networks underneath the whole of the Gaza Strip. It's bigger than the New York Metro. And this tunnel system under the Gaza Strip was used by Hamas to protect its terrorist fighters, to store its weaponry, and in the last 18 months to hide Israeli hostages. And again, there was an interview 9 months ago with a Hamas leader who was interviewed on Arabic television. And the interviewer asked him a very interesting question. She said, when the Zionists, of course, she said, when the Zionists are attacking Gaza, why can't the citizens that you complain are being killed, why can't they shelter in the tunnels that Hamas have built underground? And this Hamas leader said, but the tunnels aren't for the citizens. The tunnels are for our fighters and for our rockets. And when he was pressed on this, he said, well, the international community should protect the Gazan civilians. Imagine, and again, you know this, but so many people in the West, in America, don't. Imagine the difference between a society like Israel, where so many, if not all, of the families in the south of the country lived with a bomb shelter in their own houses. Imagine the difference between a society that builds bomb shelters for its citizens to hide in, and a society in Gaza that builds shelters to protect its bombs, and then uses the citizens to protect the bombs. Every difference in the world. Yet much of the world cannot see it.
Yeah, they value death over life, and and so they need those death rockets, and they want to protect them. Life's cheap, rockets expensive.